right, good morning. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to Myrtle Baptist Church, the adult Sunday School Bible class. It's our annual Sunday School series that we have at 9:30 on Sunday mornings. And this morning we have a very special guest. We have the Reverend Dr. Justin Reed. Dr. Reed is now an associate professor at the Louisville Presbyterian Theological Seminary, and he is our past associate minister and adult Bible Sunday school teacher during his years attending Harvard Divinity School here in Boston. So welcome, Dr. Reed.
Thank you. Oh, thank you. Thank you
Uh,
for having me.
awesome, awesome. It's good to have you back. I think you're in town for a conference,
Yeah.
and you are releasing your new book. And your new book is called The Injustice of Noah's Curse. Really, really interesting book. And can you tell us a little bit about the book, kind of how you came to write that? I know it's a part of a series of reinterpretations of the Bible that you have been involved with ever since you were in high school, I believe.
Yeah.
And so tell us a bit about this book and how it came to be.
Yeah. I can talk about it. I think the smoothest way for me to do it will be about 10-minute, 15 minutes at the most, reading the preface,
Yeah.
where I give some of the intro to how the idea came about, which actually involves this church. So,
Wonderful.
yeah, so I'll read
All right. So let's
from
go
the
ahead and do that.
preface, and you'll hear a subtle shout out to Myrtle in it. So,
All right.
So I start with a quote from William McKee Evans. This is from an article in, I think it was 1980. He said, "This strange story has troubled theologians for perhaps 2,000 years. Since it's first found in the Old Testament, a common source of Jewish, Christian, and Muslim traditions, moralists have understandably expected to find some illustration of ethics or justice. Yet the story offends our moral sensibilities at almost every point. In the first place, even when the extreme sensitivity that the ancient Hebrews are supposed to have had about nudity is taken into account, Noah's curse dwarfs Ham's offense. By any ordinary standard, ancient or modern, Noah overreacted. Second, the curse fell not upon the offender at all, but upon Canaan, a son of Ham, who in terms of the story is totally innocent. Over the centuries, theologians have often held ideas about nudity and respect for parents similar to those of the ancient Hebrews, yet they've consistently failed to find in Ham's behavior sufficient justification for Noah's curse upon Canaan." So after that epigraph, I start, when I first stumbled upon the academic discipline of biblical studies as a junior in college, I was in awe. People were asking the same questions that had always troubled me, launching strident critiques at traditional interpretations, and beginning their inquiries with doubt, not doctrine. This was not how I learned the Bible in Sunday school, but these were practices I'd been conditioned to value in other disciplines in school up to that point, and I was delighted to find that some people were reading the Bible this way. Things finally made sense. In my excitement, I was eager to share the fruits of biblical studies with anyone who might want a taste. However, I thought that most people would not read through pedantic journal articles and lengthy monographs and meticulous footnotes. And my personal experience with churches in my childhood and adolescence misled me to believe that no official Christian institution would welcome such approaches. I thought I'd need to invent some highly unconventional path for my passion, but fortunately, I was wrong. Some like-minded Christians found me. When I started graduate school, a church that embraced critical engagement with the Bible invited me to serve as a scholar in residence. I soon found myself leading a Wednesday night Bible study with a consistent crowd ready for lively discussion. We started reading Genesis, and after a couple of months, we arrived at the final episode in the life of Noah. Of course, everyone attending the Bible study knew about Noah as the righteous man whom God spared from the great flood. Even if we had not read the 3 preceding chapters of Noah's story, the group would have been familiar with that celebrated depiction of Noah and his relationship with God. But the end of Noah's life features this strange story, as you saw in that William McKee Evans quote, that was less familiar and more perplexing for the group. It's a tale in which Noah gets drunk, strips naked, and passes out in his tent. One of Noah's sons, Ham, sees Noah and tells the other two sons, who then cover their father. But when Noah wakes up, his response is to proclaim a curse of slavery on Canaan, Ham's son, who has done nothing at all in the story. After this short passage, the narrator mentions Noah's death. This is not how Noah's life ends in your typical sermon or children's Bible. Naturally, the group would have questions about Noah's actions, Ham and Canaan's role in the story, and what lesson the group is supposed to learn from this bawdy tale. Confident that the methods of biblical criticism would yield the best outcomes, I researched as diligently as is possible in a week's time, and I came to the next Wednesday night Bible study prepared to blow people's minds with the insights from revered writings of experts who I admire. I started with a taste of how this text has been interpreted over the centuries, and I pointed the group to Genesis 10, verse 6. So that whole thing was in Genesis 9. Now, Genesis 10:6, which describes Ham as the father of not just Canaan, but three sons who were ancestors of African nations. Cush, who I said represents Ethiopia, Egypt, who we all know is in Africa, and an East African kingdom known as Punt. I then shared examples of good and evil consequences that have come about when interpreters associate Ham with Africa. On the one hand, you have many African-descended people that have cherished a connection with Ham as evidence of a noble, civilized pedigree conjured by images of Egypt and Ethiopia. However, the connection between Ham and Africa has also been weaponized, with Noah's curse of slavery used to justify enslavement or other forms of subjugation in the time of interpreters. Both sides of history struck a chord with the listeners at this historically black church, and people readily shared their experiences with encountering positive and negative interpretations of Ham. The group was also quick to dissociate Ham from Noah's curse of slavery. They zeroed in on a detail that's so often emphasized by abolitionists of the past and today's Bible commentaries. Neither Ham nor any of his African descendants are cursed in the story. Only Canaan, the non-African son, is cursed. However, the fact that Canaan is cursed brought up an issue for the group. Of course, it was a welcome insight to see the curse skip over Ham and his African children, but it still didn't make sense that the curse landed on Canaan, who, according to the story, did nothing at all. Furthermore, Noah's curse of slavery seems excessive, they pointed out, considering Ham just sees his father naked. As noted in the epigraph, these are the same concerns that William McKee Evans says are the most glaring problems challenging interpreters for 2 millennia. For Evans, however, they're not formidable problems. He sidesteps the issue of the curse offending our moral sensibilities by describing the story as a sacred myth, a genre in which divine or semi-divine beings often commit deeds that violate or transcend the moral restraints of the ordinary people who believe the myth. Following Evans would have been the path of least resistance, but the introduction of Noah as righteous in the Bible, in Genesis 6:9, implies that at least in this context in the Bible, his actions should be evaluated with some relationship to questions of ethics or justice. So, I looked at what these brilliant biblical scholars had to say, and I came equipped with their exegesis to escort perplexed parishioners into the light of understanding. Now is the chance to lift the veil from my pupils' eyes with a breath of fresh air from biblical studies. Following the trend of traditional biblical scholarship, I tried to rationalize what seems strange by contextualizing the Bible in its original setting. If we could virtually travel back in time, we'd discover a version of the passage that just made more sense, at least to its first audience. So I told them about how scholars generally agree that the original version of the story had no discrepancy between who did the wrong deed and who was punished, that it was the same person in the first version. Canaan was the culprit in the initial correct version, and at some point an editor muddled the text by adding Ham as the one who did the deed and leaving Canaan as the one cursed. I said, that's what scholars say. As for the severity, I led congregates down the rabbit hole of exploring culturally specific idioms, and I summarized the interpretation from this article that often gets cited by John Seitz Bergsma and Scott Walker Hahn. Following Bergsma and Hahn, I shocked everyone with the conjecture that the crime was not literally seeing the naked patriarch, telling about his exposure, or failing to cover him up. Instead, an idiom hides from the modern reader a hideous crime that the original audience would immediately see. A sexual assault took place. Some say Noah's the victim. Bergsma and Hahn argue that the assault was against Noah's wife, but either way, with these 2 points, I showed that the story makes sense as long as we understand that Canaan was cursed for his own deed in the original version, and the ancient Israelites who heard the story knew that a horrific crime had been committed, deserving a severe reaction. This was an eye-popping perspective, to say the least. But there was one participant who narrowed her vision. "It still doesn't make sense to me," retorted Deacon B. Then she pointed out a couple issues she had with Bergsma and Hahn's interpretation, or at least my summary of their essay. I can no longer remember which concerns she raised, but I know that her insights and questions struck me. I took her critique seriously, and I told her I'd review the article, see if the author said things better than I explained them. But they hadn't. I found even more problems with their interpretation, and as I continued to review sources, I increasingly found myself in agreement with this churchgoer's resistance. The scholarly explanations that I had championed don't adequately account for the strangeness of Noah's curse. Although every interpretation was meant to fix a certain problem, the fixing of one created others. I added dozens and over the years hundreds of interpretations from every medium I could think of to my original research and saw the issue persist. Ultimately, I realized that the problem was deeper than any interpretation itself. Problems with particular readings of the passage were a symptom of a more fundamental issue, and the most central one of these possible issues is that almost all these interpretations, no matter how different from one another, rely upon, I lost my document. I know what I'm saying here. Rely upon a shared presumption. One second. A very specific but malleable presumption. If the root of the problem is a presumption that these interpretations share, I started to ask, what would the story look like if I questioned this foundational presumption or abandoned it completely? The answer I found is a new interpretation of Noah's curse, an interpretation guided by different presumptions that can make more sense of the story's meaning in its literary context. This new interpretation leans into that initial feeling that I saw in the Wednesday night Bible study, the feeling that Deacon B was bold enough to hold on to, the first reaction I continue to see whenever I introduce this story to someone new, and the issue that Evans says has troubled theologians for perhaps 2,000 years. Noah's curse seems unjust. Hundreds of interpreters cited in this book argue that the process of understanding the passage means overcoming that initial reaction. But I've found that the story is most coherent when we can recognize the injustice of Noah's curse. Thanks.
Awesome, awesome. And it brings back memories
Of that Bible
those,
study.
Those days and those evenings, which were very insightful and impactful. And I do remember so many of those conversations. So now you have a couple of really provocative chapter titles, like Bad Dad, Bad Deed, Bad People. So what are you inviting us to think about who the bad guy is, if there's one in this story?
Good question. So the titles are meant to be provocative. They're meant to get you to actually read what comes next. I see these presumptions as guiding people to ask certain questions about the content in the story and to close off other sets of questions. And so the different chapters that have those titles, there's 4 of them that have those titles, point to a certain frame, a certain way that people are looking at how to make meaning of the passage. So, for example, the first one of them is bad editing. And when people try to make meaning of a story that seems like it just doesn't add up, Noah, it tells about what Ham did, says Canaan is Ham's son. It doesn't say Canaan did anything. And then it says Noah cursed Canaan. And it doesn't explain because ... It just says Noah cursed Canaan. This whole bad editing idea is something that scholars really commonly use to say, well, when you see those sort of incongruities, we can say whoever is handling this text had a few different traditions, a few different things that they were putting together, and they just left it in tension. It was bad editing. They could have smoothed things out, and they didn't. And I'm not arguing against the idea that the Bible was composed by bringing together different traditions, but I don't think that someone was just incompetent in putting this really sophisticated, complex Bible that we have together. I think that at some level, they said this makes sense for this, that, and that reason. And that's not the same that we, today, when we say, yeah, it looks like bad editing, I think that that closes off the questions about, well, what reason does it make sense that Noah cursed the wrong person? And so I've done that with the different chapters. Some of them, and that one I'm being critical of who we frame as bad, the bad editing. I'm critical in that one. But then another one, bad dad, this is not personal. I'm saying that many interpreters cut off a critique of Noah, aren't willing to entertain the possibility that in this action, in what he's doing here, he's not being good as a father, right? So they're not all the same direction in being critical, but I am thinking about how people cut off certain questions, certain avenues for interpretation by having an idea of who's bad and good.
Interesting.
It is, it's very, yeah.
No, and you've got another chapter that asks, where is God? And so,
Big question. If you want to know the answer, it's in the book. Yeah.
so where is God in this story? And why does that matter to how we respond to injustice?
Yeah, so I think that question relates in very strong ways to the consequences that this story has had across history. Mm-hmm. Because this is a story that combines, when you look at Genesis chapter 9 and Genesis chapter 10, it combines a curse that involves slavery, that's in Genesis chapter 9, and it involves Ham. And then you go to Genesis chapter 10, you see Ham is the father of at least 3 African peoples. And so this where is God question, sometimes in history, this text has been weaponized against black people, and they've drawn God into the story as part of that weaponization. They say, well, the most innocent way to say it, the people who might not be benefiting from enslaving black people, right, might look around and say, I see black people in slavery, I believe that God controls history, so I must believe that what's happening around me has something to do with the will of God. And then they look in the Bible and they say, I believe the Bible testifies to the truth of God working in the world, and they'll bring God into it. That's the most innocent way to say it, but I don't think that's the most often way it's been approached. You see people who, and what I point out in that chapter, you see people who, to some degree or other, conflate Noah with God. Noah says this curse, and they'll say, well, Noah is righteous. Noah is prophetically speaking God's will. Noah is accurately describing God's sentiments about this. They'll even leave Noah out the question and just say God cursed Ham or Canaan. And that's how it's been. So I parse out the history of how this has been interpreted relative to bringing God into it. But then also, I talk about how my book, being interested in the justice or injustice of the curse, isn't identical to asking about God's role in it. So I try to separate those issues. Uh, it's a little technical to get into that right now, but I try to separate those issues because I think they can be investigated independently of each other.
Independent. So that leads to my next question.
Uh-oh.
That you mentioned it, but does actually naming the injustice in the Bible, ever threaten our view of Scripture, or can it deepen our trust in God?
Yeah. So when I approached this topic, I'm trying to be I'm trying to be self-aware of what I bring to the table, and also have some awareness of how different interpreters have a different theology overall, different idea about what the Bible is, different big picture understanding of how this fits into a longer story in Genesis or in the Bible. And those differences include that I'm heavily influenced by a history of black interpreters who have a suspicion about connecting the Bible directly to God, about saying that the Bible directly reveals God's will. A suspicion that would lead Nancy Ambrose, that's Howard Thurman's grandmother, when she would ask him to read her the Bible, that suspicion would lead her to say, read me these passages, but please skip over Paul. Maybe she doesn't know how to say the truth in argument with Paul, but she knows that's not the God that I've come to recognize, so don't try to send that part of the Bible against me, right? Whether it's from her or from other people across history, I've embraced an idea from black people that a healthy way of reading the Bible includes being able to say, hey, I don't think that that text, the way that you're saying it, is the best representation of who God is, how God works in my life. And it can be that taking a different text shows me a better angle. It can be that just resisting that text shows me who God is. And not everyone has that same hermeneutic. And so as I go through the book, I am trying to be self-aware of where I'm coming from, and I recognize that that can be threatening to other people's faiths. And at some points in the book, I do try to take the key insights that I'm coming up with and relate them to people's hermeneutics that are different from mine. So I see, hey, this person has an idea of the Bible's ethical inerrancy. That's like their hermeneutic. And they don't recognize the injustice of Noah's curse. But here's their bigger interpretation. And even though I don't have the same bigger interpretation, I don't have the same hermeneutic, I think that their bigger interpretation would look more coherent if they adopted these pieces from my interpretation. So I try to be sensitive to the fact that it's not a one-size-fits-all. I'm not trying to tell everyone my interpretation, along with all of who I am, is the one right way. But I do think that people have brought these presumptions to many different ways that they've dealt with this text, and they need to interrogate and overturn some of those presumptions.
Would you call this a practice of hopeful suspicion, where you can take a harmful text seriously without giving up hope?
Yeah, that sounds good. Yeah, yeah. I think that suspicion Suspicion, so a hermeneutic of suspicion is the term that I learned, and then I know that people who hold on to the Bible for their faith, at least in the black church tradition, hope is like huge, right? So I recognize that pairing as being valuable. The words that I use in like the conclusion to my book is vigilance, because I think about that as really important. An awareness, an intentionality of being aware is what I think of with vigilance, and that includes being aware of past consequences for how a text has been understood and used, vigilance about what's there in the text, and also the continued potential of what it could be. And that vigilance can be hopeful or can be suspicious, but it's more than just being passive, you know?
Yes.
So,
Yeah. You mentioned speech act theory is
I
about
did.
what a text does as opposed to what it says. How does paying attention to speech act theory change how we hear Noah's curse?
Yeah. Um, the short of it, speech act theory is, in the specific thing that I'm talking about, it has to do with this idea that sometimes uh, words describe things, but other times words are doing something and not just describing things. If there's a wedding ceremony here and Reverend Crowley gives people instructions, they say, do you take this man, dot, 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 and do you take this person, and then they say, I do, they're not just describing something. When they say I do, they're actually doing something in the ceremony, right? So that theory includes blessings and curses. That blessings and curses aren't just describing something, but they're doing something. And what makes it official? I could say the exact same things from a wedding ceremony, and none of us are going to think that because somebody nodded in the audience and said "I do," mumbled "I do," that automatically two people just got married. We
In
don't.
a
We don't.
court.
Yeah. We don't just assume. So there's certain things that you, as a community, understand are the right context, maybe the right person who has authority, the right sentiments on the inside to make these things effective. And so when I'm talking about the injustice of Noah's curse, I'm treating that curse as part of this idea of speech act theory, where the words that Noah is saying are doing something. They're not just describing something, they're doing something. And so in my interpretation, that disconnects the question of, okay, does it get fulfilled here or there, or does it never get fulfilled? That question is disconnected from whether it was just or not. You can look at it and say, is this a just curse based on whether it was directed at the right person, it was done with him being drunk or not, whether it was an overreaction? Like, that's one question. A completely separate question is, was it effective? And that would have to do with speech act theory on what are the things that make a curse effective. It's a separate question from what are the things that make it just or unjust. So that's how I use it in that chapter.
You also touch on this idea of reading with communities. And so what does it mean to kind of read with communities who have suffered from the misuse of the curse, rather than just kind of reading about them?
Yeah, I think there's a certain sensitivity that people should have to how people try to make meaning. So, for example, communities who have been told, we are cursed because we're descendants of Ham, or you're not fully human because you're not descendants of Adam. Which one do you choose? You're like, oh, jeez. Like, so when you see the ways that, you know, African American intellectuals in the 19th century are trying so hard to connect us to Ham's descendants, to say, look, we have a lineage that goes back to great empires and great people in the Bible, and then you have um, black enslaved people who are like, what do you mean? We're not the Egyptians, we're the Israelites, the Hebrews. We're being oppressed by the Egyptians. Why are you saying we're the descendants of the Egyptians? Like, you can have more compassion for understanding. They're between, Pharaoh and the sea. Like, there's not just like a happy, uncoerced interpretation to be made from there. People are choosing between difficult options. So yeah, more
Interesting.
compassion.
Interesting. So you're more than a scholar now. You're a dad,
True, biggest accomplishment.
and you have the, how should we say, the God view in your purview of prerogative and providence and grace.
This is big,
And
big
so,
stuff.
how has being a parent, is it 3 and 5 year olds,
Yeah,
right?
3 and a 5-year-old. Yeah.
Affected the way you hear this story, especially the part about a father who curses his
Yeah, I gotta keep my
grandson.
clothes on. That's what it means. No. um, yeah. Yeah. I'm not 100% sure how to answer it. As a father, I think Bible's not a kid's story. I'm not going to bring this one up for a while.
That's right.
Let them get a little older before I tell them
It's
this
just
one. Yeah, Dad wrote a book, but don't read it. Yeah. Yeah, I do think about the implications of this story across generations. I'm not sure that I wouldn't think about this without being a father, but there was one interpretation that I thought was really interesting that was very much about thinking about it in a family context, not trying to extrapolate it out to people groups, Israelites and Canaanites, but thinking, well, what does it actually look like in a family where a grandfather says a curse regarding a grandchild? You think, oh, what would people grow up like? This is in the Africa Bible Commentary. There were two contributors who worked together on Genesis. It's on the video, so someone can look this up. Barnabe Asohoto and Samuel Ngewa. And they said, this is one of the few interpretations I find where someone else is saying Noah's curse is unjust. And they say that when you think about this injustice, just imagine Canaan, as a grandchild, being told, learning, your grandfather has cursed you for what your father did. How does that show really deeply the injustice of what Noah's done? And how is that going to fracture the relationships between not just family members, which definitely is going to happen, but also between them and God, right? This is your grandfather's God who saved your family before you were born, and you're trying to live into that relationship, but now you know from birth you're cursed by your own grandfather. And I thought that was a really deep interpretation. There's another one while I'm at it. Zora Neale Hurston she wrote plays throughout her life, and this is one of the earliest ones she's published. It was in 1927. It's called The First One. And she takes this story and she dramatizes it, and it's clearly an injustice. Everyone in the story knows, hey, Noah, you cursed the wrong person, take it back, what are you doing? Everyone in the story knows that. And I think in that family context, there's emotion there, and it's so much more meaningful to wrestle with, man, what is this story? And the title, her ambiguous title, gives us the space to wrestle. What is the first one? Why name this story the first one? What does that mean? First can mean in chronological order, the first one, and then you'd say, well, the first of what? What is the first thing in chronological order that this is? Is it the first curse? Is it the first scapegoating? Is it the first sibling rivalry. That's how she tells the story, like the first one. And then first can also mean first in a hierarchy, because she describes the problem that starts it coming from a sibling rivalry. Who's going to be first? Who's going to be Noah's favorite? And I think all of the ways that she put it into a family story really bring the text to life and are theologically meaningful. So, yeah, I can say stuff about family. I'm not so sure about how it fits with my own, but yeah.
Yeah. What practices do you think, ask a question about families and then congregations, what practices can families use at home when they bump into hard passages? So
Yeah, that's a good
that
question.
invite honesty and faithfulness um, in reading scripture.
Um, I think it's good to take an inventory of how someone feels rather than to ignore people's emotions or push them aside. So when someone brings up that um, a text um, is challenging, it doesn't seem right, it doesn't seem like it's from God, you don't immediately try to give an answer, but you help people to articulate their emotions and then go from emotions to good questions um, that can lead out of that, because um, those two things are connected. And for me, one of the things that I like to go to from there is to open up the space to hear different answers to the same question. Um, that way, people feel a um, a invitation to engage with the Bible, to seriously say, I'm going to figure out what I think, and I'm going to keep searching through the Bible because you showed me that other people do that and they don't all say the same thing. So it makes a difference that I'm asking these questions and thinking through it. Um, and so that's what I've tried to do. There was an example. Hi, Stephanie. There was an example with Chase where he was asking about Judas. We were reading the gospel, and he was like, Judas seems so evil in this story. Um, how do we like? Why is that? And we talked about what exactly his questions were from it, but then I took him from there to looking at a couple different ways that people have wrestled with that. And there was a poem, there was a movie or movie. Um, there was a gospel that we don't have anymore, an ancient gospel, and I talked about these different ways that people wrestled with it. And to me, that's like opening things up to say, hey, these are good questions. Don't think that there's one answer and you just need to go and find the person who's just going to give you all the answers, but think, hey, this is a valuable thing. Maybe I can keep asking and learning as I go through, and that'll make a more intentional and personal relationship with the Bible and God.
Is there is that one of the ways that you'd say the book is inviting conversations or inviting congregations to do the work beyond reading it? I know in your time here, certainly you invited us to experience the Bible
I do.
beyond reading it. So, what would you say is an open invitation to congregations as they go through and read the book, or as their members read the
Yeah,
book?
um, I think that that idea that you described as suspicion and
Hopeful suspicion.
hopeful suspicion, what I was talking about with vigilance, I think that's part of what I'm inviting anybody who's got this book to come away with, as opposed to assurance that it's all going to be fine, or throwing away the Bible, which I'm not pushing for, right? I think that hopeful suspicion, that vigilance is what I'm inviting people to engage with this and other difficult texts. So yeah.
Awesome. So, Justin, it has been a pleasure um, having you here. I don't know if we've got a few minutes to have some questions or some comments from any of our our audience members present here. If there's anyone who's got a kind of question or comment that they'd like for Dr. Reed, we'd love to have them. Yes.
I don't know if there's a real answer to this, but it just seems odd to me that there are curses in a book that's supposedly about love and God. Like why, how that makes sense. And, you know, besides the fact of a grandfather cursing, putting a curse on a grandchild, but the fact that a curse is something accepted
Yeah.
um, in this book environment. And I don't know quite what my question is. I
Yeah.
don't know if I'd say explain that, but it just seems odd to me.
What I'm hearing from you is that you have an overall idea of what the Bible is that is helpful, it's good, and it involves love, right? Um, Curses don't fit well with that idea. I get that. That makes sense to me. Um, I think it leads to different types of ways to answer your question. I can't answer it all here, but I'd say there's things that have to do with um, historical answers where people just say, well, let's go back to that time and try to contextualize what was happening and what people were doing and how they understood their religion. But then there's also, I don't know if the right word to describe as practical answers, but answers that have to do with what are you going to do with this now? Like, how are you going to deal with that particular element of the Bible that isn't just in this one passage, but is in different passages, doesn't just come from people, but sometimes comes from God, right? What are you going to do with that? And I think that's a really helpful thing to wrestle with. So, yeah. Sorry, I don't have the answer, but yeah. Yeah.
Welcome to the Bible. Any others?
I just have a comment, really. Well, comment question. Do you think, based on some of your interpretations of things in general, when you read in the Bible, so a lot of it is somebody's interpretation. It's God directed, but
Hmm.
a lot of the commentary, a lot of the wording in there is based on like particular humans where they sat at that moment, right? It's not always so. It's just like today. It ain't all explainable.
Mm.
We're dealing with humans sitting there,
Yeah.
wherever they're sitting right now, trying to
Yeah.
espouse what they think is right or
Yeah.
wrong, right? So is that part of the struggle then, is trying to figure that piece out?
My personal belief, and I think it's a faithful thing to do, is to acknowledge that whatever divine inspiration means doesn't erase the human element. Um, and and so I think that what you're saying makes perfect sense. Um, the Bible, at least, was written by human hands, right? You can say, well, there's more. These human hands weren't. I don't believe these human hands were controlled by a divine puppeteer. I think it also filtered through human minds, human cultures, human events. Um, but not everyone believes that. And one of the things that I'm finding interesting is individuals, but more groups that have a very stringent view of how divine inspiration works with inerrant scripture, that this is directly, every word is directly the will of God, are taking parts of my argument that they find helpful and not other parts. And it's just an interesting thing for me to see how those things change. Um, at the end of the day, I think that the way that you articulated it, the way that I think about it, helps us to be on the right side of history with things that haven't been universally condemned yet. I think the detriment to people who have a different theology than me is that idea that every word in here is perfect most often has meant that they've been latecomers to the push for um, the progress and have had the later, apology for slavery. Now we think something different about women's rights than we used to, right? As opposed to, at the moment, pushing forward. That's, to me, that's the big stake in the difference. Yeah. Thanks for
Yeah.
sharing that.
Yes.
Dr. Reed, we are so proud of you and we love you so much.
Thanks.
And this is an amazing feat to get this first book published, and so we congratulate you on that. I'm interested to know what's in your mind for the next book. What are you thinking about?
That's what the publishers asked me too, yeah. So the Africa Bible commentary interpretation I mentioned, Zora Neale Hurston's interpretation I mentioned, there's a handful of these that I didn't really expand on very much in the book. I gave them maybe a page or two, but I think that these are really fascinating ways to show that people with very different starting points can come at this text and find things that are inspiring for different groups. And so being a folklorist, being pretty humanist, Zora Neale Hurston appeals to a certain crowd that's not the same as the Africa Bible commentary appeals to, not the same as there's a handful of these, a Jewish commentary, a Jewish Torah Women's Bible commentary. There's a handful of these that I want to give a chapter each to and really expand on them in a much shorter, accessible book where people can say, oh, that fits where I'm coming from, and now I have some more guidance. And really what I want to teach people is from seeing the same text interpreted similarly, but with some crucial differences by these different interpreters, people to understand with my guidance, what is it about those interpreters that is different, about their ways of making meaning, so you can see, maybe now this is the one I vibe with the most, so these are the ways of meaning that are the best for me. And I thought coming into this that I fit this camp, but actually this is what makes sense to me. Or it will be the same thing that you thought, and now you're like, whoa, I didn't know I could think this way about this text, but this is where I'm coming from. So helping people to understand what the term in biblical studies is hermeneutics, helping people to understand hermeneutics with these examples in each of a different chapter.
So Justin,
Yeah.
are you thinking about that at the micro level or at the macro level? So when you started talking about it, I thought to what end? So is the goal sort of intellectual project? Is the goal sort of a way to have individuals understand their relationship, either with this Bible or with their faith? Or might the goal be collective in thinking as individuals understand that
Congregation.
they can see how or whether we all fit in the same religion? So I would say I'm coming from this right now
Yeah.
in thinking, do black folks really think about the Bible
Mm.
and their God culturally differently because of historical circumstances that have caused us to do that? Is that therefore seen as an outlier to understand it in a public way and to be able to have traction, so to speak, with a more public movement
Yeah.
that might be being utilized for agenda setting political purposes? So I'm just
Yeah.
wondering, if you are goal setting, do you back into that at all? Or is your project a more sort of isolated, smaller project, power system than sort of the larger power system?
I think that what you just explained is really interesting. I want to learn more. My initial idea was more individual. My initial idea was thinking about individuals and what individuals and maybe small groups would understand. But I hear what you're saying about not only a collective and relating it to context for a bigger group around shared experience or shared identity, right? And political projects. That's really interesting and I think important. Yeah, I mean, I'll keep thinking about it. Yeah, yeah,
And using their words, not just being scripted, but using
yeah, yes.
Yeah. And so at the end of the hour, we thank you, Justin. We love you.
Thanks.
It is wonderful, as always, to have you. Uh, we know that and we appreciate how you have created a safe space for us to say that this text troubles us without feeling that we're bad Christians. And to
Can I end? I want to say thank you to
thank you.
this church,
Yeah.
what this church has meant for me. I tried to put a little bit of that into the preface, but the real thing is, I was on a trajectory of I figured out what I like, and I thought I didn't really fit in a Christian space. And this is a church that told me the exact opposite. Don't change. What you're bringing is actually valuable, and valuable at a black church. And to me, that's been the best. Like I went back to LA, went to Louisville. I haven't found a church like this. So yeah.
Amen. So thank you. Thank you for your books and thank you for just the experiences that you have opened us to. And thank you everyone for coming in today. Thank you everyone online for looking at this broadcast. And of course, it will be on YouTube for you to look at again and again and again and read the book, right? The Injustice of Noah's Curse. A whole new view with some captivating chapters, right?
Yep.
Captivating reading. All
Thank
right.
you.
Thank you, everyone.